Late at night, in a small, dimly lit apartment on the edge of the city, a group of men sat around a worn-out table covered with papers, laptops, and empty coffee cups. Their faces were tense, eyes darting around the room, as if someone might be watching them from the shadows. The air smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and fear. They were used to taking risks, pushing the limits, but tonight was different. Tonight, they had decided to cross a line they had never thought of before. They had been under investigation for months. Small things had started to add up: a few suspicious transactions, whispered rumors of illegal deals, and a sense that someone was always a step ahead. They knew the FBI was involved, and in their minds, that made them dangerous. But they didn't think the FBI director at the top of the organization would ever personally take notice. That kind of thinking made them bold, maybe too bold, I'm telling you, one of them said, leaning forward with a hard edge in his voice. If we don't make them back off, this is going to end badly for us. We can't just wait around while they close in. His hands shook slightly, betraying the nervousness he tried to hide behind bravado. Another, older and calmer, shook his head. Intimidating the director? Are you serious? That's not something people just do. You know what that could lead to? The first man smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. Exactly. That's why it has to happen. They think they're untouchable. Let's show them we're not scared. A message. Something that makes it clear we know who's in charge. Then maybe they'll ease off. For a long moment, silence filled the room. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, and the occasional creak of the building made it feel larger and emptier than it really was. Everyone knew this was risky. Everyone knew one wrong move could ruin their lives. But the need to feel in control, to fight back against the invisible pressure that had been building for months, was stronger than caution. They began planning, not in a clear, structured way, but in a frenzy of ideas, whispered suggestions, and half-formed threats. One person suggested sending anonymous messages. Another suggested showing up at a location where the director might be, hoping to scare them, to shake them. The older man shook his head again, trying to think of a way to stop it, but he stayed silent. He knew arguing now wouldn't help. The others were too far gone, intoxicated by the sense of power that came from breaking rules. They went through the possibilities, laughing nervously at some, growing more serious with others. Every idea seemed dangerous, but the thrill made it feel necessary. They didn't see the risk clearly, they only saw the chance to assert themselves. To make the invisible people who were tracking them feel afraid. Outside, the city slept. The lights from office buildings cast faint shadows on the streets below, and the occasional car passed slowly, unaware of the storm brewing above. None of the men thought about what it would be like if someone caught them. None of them thought about the cameras, the surveillance, or the careful eyes that might already be on them. One of them pulled out his phone and started drafting a message. Short, sharp, meant to unsettle, to intimidate. He read it aloud, the words sounding braver than they felt in his chest. The others nodded, approving, feeding off each other's fear and excitement. Send it, someone said finally. A tiny rush of adrenaline surged through the room as the message left the phone and disappeared into the unknown. For a moment, they sat back, feeling the illusion of control. They were proud, thinking they had taken a bold step, one that would make the FBI think twice. They imagined the director reading the message, pausing, reconsidering everything. They imagined fear in the face of someone who had seemed untouchable. But even in their moment of triumph, quiet tension lingered. One of them rubbed his hands together, glancing at the others. We can't stop now. We've got to be ready if they respond. We can't back down. And so they planned more. Every detail mattered: the timing, the location, the way they would appear to be careful, but still visible enough to be a warning. They didn't see it yet, but in their eagerness, they had already made mistakes. Their movements were not as secret as they thought. Their communications, their meetings, even their shared laughter and whispered excitement were leaving traces in another part of the city. Far away from their dim apartment, someone else was already paying attention. It wasn't visible, not obvious. No one was knocking on doors. No one was pointing guns or making threats. But the information was being gathered, analyzed, and understood. Every unusual action, every hint of overconfidence, every misstep added to a growing picture. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the FBI director began to understand what was happening. Back in the apartment, the men grew bolder. They laughed at the danger, thinking it couldn't reach them. They imagined a world where the FBI would hesitate, where their authority would shake the top of the organization. One man even drew a crude map, showing where they thought they might meet resistance, where they could leave a warning. They nodded approvingly, feeding off their own illusions of control. Hours passed. The night grew colder. The adrenaline started to fade, leaving a nervous, jittery feeling in the room. Yet no one wanted to admit fear. They were still convinced they could bend the rules of power. Still convinced they could intimidate someone who had spent years learning how to handle threats like theirs. As dawn approached, they finally dispersed, some heading home, some staying to clean up the evidence of their meeting. None of them slept well. Excitement mingled with fear, the two emotions intertwined in a way that made it impossible to rest. Every sound in the apartment building, every passing car, every shadow on the wall seemed like it could be something more. They had stepped into a world they barely understood. The FBI director, meanwhile, was unaware of the specifics, but felt the faint stirrings of an unusual pattern. Nothing alarming yet, only small signs, hints of a challenge that might be coming. Those signs were enough. The director had faced threats before and knew the mind of someone who thought they could intimidate law enforcement. The difference was the director's calm, methodical approach, which the men in the apartment had not even considered by the time the sun rose. Painting the city in pale gold and gray, the men thought they had won a small victory. They had made their move, felt powerful, and imagined themselves untouchable. They had no idea that their first step had already set in motion a chain of events that they could not control, that the power they sought to wield was already turning against them. And somewhere, quietly, the FBI director's team was beginning to pay attention, noticing details that others might overlook, ready to prepare for whatever came next. The night had ended for the men, but for the story, it had only just begun. The morning started quietly at the FBI headquarters. The building buzzed with the usual energy, agents moving between offices, phones ringing, and the low hum of computers. The FBI director arrived early, as always, moving through the corridors with a calm and steady pace. Years of experience had taught them that danger often hid in small details, in moments that others might dismiss. Sitting down at their desk, the director opened a series of reports that had arrived overnight. On the surface, nothing seemed unusual. Just a few ongoing investigations and standard updates. But the director's eyes, trained to notice subtle patterns, lingered on one particular report longer than usual. It wasn't a clear threat yet, but something felt off. A sense of unease, the kind that comes from knowing people think they can push boundaries without consequences, filled the room. The director leaned back in the chair and thought carefully. There had been warning signs over the past weeks, unexplained calls. Messages that seemed harmless at first, but had a hidden edge. A few minor incidents that didn't fit together in any obvious way. The criminals were clever, but cleverness could only go so far against experience. The director knew that those who tried to intimidate often revealed more than they realized. Meanwhile, in the field, agents were already following subtle clues. Surveillance cameras had picked up unusual movements near certain locations tied to the suspects. Anonymous tips had been called in, and though some seemed trivial, the director knew they could be pieces of a larger puzzle. Every detail was being logged, every pattern analyzed. Nothing was left to chance. In the director's office, a sense of calm control filled the air. Unlike the criminals plotting in their small, dim apartment, there was no panic, no desperate need to act quickly. The director understood that patience and observation were far more powerful than fear or aggression. A meeting was called with a small, trusted team, and quietly strategies were discussed. They went over the surveillance reports, reviewed every communication that had raised questions, and considered what the suspects might try next. "They're testing boundaries," one agent said. "They think sending a message or making a small move will scare someone, but they don't understand who they're dealing with." The director nodded slowly. Exactly. That's what makes them dangerous. They believe they're in control, and that confidence is their weakness. We need to watch carefully, collect everything, and wait for the right moment. Outside the headquarters, the city moved on unaware. People went to work, children walked to school, and cars streamed down the streets. The criminals, meanwhile, were already planning their next step. They thought their previous attempt had been bold, and they were eager to push further. But they had no idea that every message, every step, had been quietly observed. Every movement had been catalogued and analyzed by people who understood the consequences of rash actions. The director spent hours reviewing patterns, looking for inconsistencies and hidden meanings. They studied the suspects' past actions, noticing how overconfidence often led people to reveal themselves without even realizing it. The team began tracing connections between the suspects, mapping out who had influence, who followed orders, and who might panic under pressure. Every detail mattered. In a quiet office, the director picked up the phone. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, confirming certain pieces of information. No one spoke in anger or frustration. There was no need. The director understood that intimidation relied on fear and chaos, while patience relied on clarity and control. Meanwhile, one of the criminals paced in the apartment, phone in hand, waiting for a response that never came. Their overconfidence began to show cracks. They must be scared, one said, trying to reassure the others. If they weren't, they would have responded by now. Another frowned. Or maybe we misjudged them. Maybe they aren't as easy to scare as we thought. The first man laughed nervously. No, they're just playing smart. That's all. We just need to push a little more, show them we mean business. The older man in the apartment stayed quiet, watching the younger ones. He could see the fear growing beneath the bravado, the uncertainty they tried to hide. Deep down, he understood that their plan was reckless. But the others were too caught up in their illusion of power to listen. Back at the FBI, the director considered the possibilities. They knew the suspects were overconfident, that they believed they could intimidate authority. But that made them predictable. The director had faced similar situations before. The key was to stay calm, to let the overconfidence lead the criminals into mistakes. Every phone call, every step they took, would now be part of a carefully recorded history that could be used to prevent harm and ensure accountability. By midday, the director had made a quiet but firm decision. No aggressive actions would be taken yet. Instead, the team would continue monitoring, gathering evidence, and preparing for any attempt to escalate. The director understood that rushing in would only play into the criminals' hands. The real power came from staying calm, observing, and letting the criminals' own actions reveal their vulnerabilities in their apartment. The criminals decided it was time to meet in person to make sure their threat was understood. They believed proximity would amplify fear. They didn't know that this decision would place them directly under observation, that every move they made would be recorded and analyzed. They felt bold, unstoppable even, as if they had the upper hand. The director, aware of the potential for escalation, instructed the team to prepare for all outcomes. Backup plans were quietly put in place, communications lines checked, and agents stationed strategically. The director's calm demeanor set the tone for the entire team. They were ready for anything, yet patient enough to wait for the right moment, even as the criminals continued their plans. Unaware of the depth of scrutiny they were under, the FBI director and their team moved with precision. Every small detail, the timing of movements, the wording of messages, the locations visited was noted. Nothing was left to chance. The criminals believed they were in control, but in reality, they were stepping into a carefully constructed web, one that they could not see and would not understand until it was too late. As the afternoon light faded and evening approached, the director remained focused, methodical, and calm. They knew that the criminals' overconfidence was their greatest weakness. By observing quietly, preparing thoroughly, and thinking strategically, they had already begun turning the situation in their favor. Every small action by the suspects was another piece of evidence, another step toward ensuring that the attempt to intimidate would fail. The criminals, still buzzing with energy and anticipation, had no idea how closely they were being watched. They imagined themselves as clever and daring, while in reality, every movement was being anticipated. Their plan was fragile, based on assumptions rather than knowledge. While the director's team worked with facts, experience, and foresight by the time the night returned. The director had a clear understanding of the situation. The suspects were confident, dangerous, and unaware of the trap that was slowly closing around them. Calmly, the director briefed the team, outlining next steps, ensuring that everyone knew their role. There was no panic, no rush, only preparation. And somewhere across the city, the criminals continued to plan, thinking that the day had gone as they intended. They believed they had made progress, that their intimidation would have an impact. Little did they know, every attempt, every movement, had already been carefully noted and would soon lead to consequences they could not control. The first step had been taken. But now, the real game was beginning, and the FBI director was already several moves ahead. The criminals were restless. Days of planning and waiting had built a sense of urgency and impatience. They met again in the same dim apartment, leaning over laptops and scribbled notes, talking in low, hurried voices. Every detail mattered to them: the timing, the wording of their messages, the exact places they might appear. They were convinced that they could make an impact, that they could instill fear in someone who seemed untouchable. One of them slammed a fist lightly on the table, frustration breaking through the careful act of confidence. "We've waited long enough. They think they can ignore us. We have to make them feel it. They have to know we're serious." The older man stayed silent, watching the others. He could feel the tension in the room, the growing recklessness. He knew that crossing the line to direct confrontation was dangerous, that the risks had multiplied. But the others were blinded by their desire to control the situation. They didn't see the invisible net that had already been cast around them, outside. The city moved on, unaware, and inside the apartment, a sense of excitement mixed with fear created a strange energy. They felt bold, unstoppable even, as if courage alone could carry them through any danger. They didn't know that at that very moment. The FBI director was already aware of their plans, that every movement, every whisper, was quietly being monitored. Finally, they made a decision. They would attempt a direct confrontation, thinking proximity would amplify fear. They imagined themselves walking into a room, showing their power, making the director reconsider the investigation. It was an idea built on arrogance, ignorance, and desperation. Meanwhile, the FBI headquarters, the director and the team had prepared. Every possible scenario had been anticipated. Surveillance, communication lines, backup measures, all were in place. The director did not act hastily, calm and methodical. They understood that the criminals' overconfidence was their greatest vulnerability. The confrontation began quietly. The criminals approached the chosen location, careful to appear cautious, yet unable to hide the tension in their movements. Each step they took was part of their plan to intimidate, to make their presence felt. They imagined the director's reaction, the fear, the hesitation, the pause that would signal success. But when they arrived, nothing went as expected. The environment was secure, quiet, and controlled. Their presence did not create fear. It only highlighted their own nervousness. Every camera, every agent, every precaution had been prepared to record, monitor, and neutralize any attempt at threat. One of the criminals tried to speak, attempting to assert dominance through words, but his voice faltered under the weight of the situation. The others looked around, confusion and doubt creeping in. They had imagined control, power, and fear. Instead, they found calm, order, and readiness. Back in the headquarters, the director observed silently. No dramatic confrontation, no overt display of authority, only careful observation, patience, and quiet control. Every move the criminals made was documented, analyzed, and anticipated. The director's team moved in synchrony, ready to act if necessary. Yet leaving the criminals, unaware of how closely they were being watched, the criminals began to feel the first twinges of panic. Their bold plan, the one they had rehearsed endlessly, was unraveling. Nothing about the situation matched their expectations. They had expected hesitation, fear, even respect. What they found was precision, patience, an unshakable calm. One of the younger criminals whispered, almost to himself, "Something's wrong. This isn't what we thought it would be." The older man in the group who had warned against this course from the start finally spoke. "I told you. We're overestimating ourselves. We're not dealing with ordinary people. Step back before it's too late." But it was too late for caution. The plan had already been set into motion, and retreat now would feel like failure to those who had staked their pride on boldness. They tried to regain control, to push forward, but their movements were sloppy, anxious. Their fear, subtle at first, began to grow. Every detail of their attempt, where they stood, what they said, how they moved, was recorded. The director watched quietly, allowing the criminals' own actions to reveal their weaknesses. The more they tried to intimidate, the more mistakes they made. Confidence turned to confusion. Arrogance turned to doubt. At one point, one of them realized the absence of reaction was worse than any fear. The director did not flinch, did not react. The calmness, the control, the quiet assurances was unnerving. They had imagined fear and got the opposite. They had imagined hesitation and found certainty. Their own confidence crumbled under the weight of patience. Outside, agents subtly moved into positions to ensure safety. The criminals did not notice. They were too wrapped up in their plan, too focused on what they thought they were achieving. Each misstep, however small, only made it easier for the director and the team to maintain control without revealing their strength. The confrontation ended not with chaos, but with a quiet realization. The criminals left the location, their minds racing, their bravado faltering. They had tried to assert control, to intimidate, to bend someone else to their will. Instead, they were confronted with calm intelligence, with preparation that exceeded anything they had anticipated. Back at the FBI headquarters, the director reviewed the events with the team. No one needed to speak loudly. The criminals had exposed themselves, revealed their plans, and demonstrated their weaknesses. The director's calm demeanor and measured approach had allowed the situation to be observed fully, ensuring no risk while gathering all the information needed. The criminals, meanwhile, began to understand the first real truth of their mistake. They had assumed they could manipulate fear, that boldness alone could make them untouchable. They had assumed they knew the limits of authority. But the reality was different. Confidence without knowledge, boldness without strategy, and arrogance without understanding could never succeed against preparation, experience. And calm, the older man in the group watched quietly as the younger ones processed their failure. Their realization was slow, creeping in like cold water. Every plan they had made, every risk they had taken now seemed reckless. They began to understand too late that they had underestimated the person they had sought to intimidate by the end of the day. The criminals returned to their apartment, exhausted, frustrated, and shaken. Their bravado was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. They had confronted someone they believed they could intimidate, only to find themselves powerless. Their mistake was clear, but understanding it did not make the consequences any less real. The FBI director, sitting quietly in their office, did not celebrate or gloat. The job was not about emotion, but about strategy and patience. The criminals had revealed themselves, and the groundwork had been laid for the next steps. Calm, careful observation had turned a potentially dangerous situation into an opportunity to understand, anticipate, and prevent harm. As night fell over the city, the criminals in their apartment were left with only questions and fear. They had tried to confront power with arrogance, only to find themselves outmatched by patience and preparation. Every movement they had made, every message they had sent, had been watched, recorded, and analyzed. And the director, calm and vigilant, was already several steps ahead. Waiting for the next move they would inevitably make, the confrontation had failed, not with violence, but with strategy. The criminals had thought they could instill fear. Instead, they had encountered control, And in that control, they had begun to see the reality of their situation. The criminals returned to their apartment in silence. The kind of quiet that felt heavier than any noise. The earlier excitement had vanished, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. The night outside seemed darker, colder, as if reflecting the mood inside. They sat around the table, staring at the laptops and papers, trying to make sense of what had just happened. One of them finally spoke, voice low and hesitant. "I don't understand." Nothing happened. No one reacted. They didn't even flinch. The older man shook his head slowly. That's because they weren't supposed to. They were watching, waiting, making us reveal ourselves without even touching us. That's how they do it. Confusion filled the room. The others looked at him as if hearing a foreign language. Their minds tried to wrap around the reality that had been slipping through their fingers since the confrontation. The overconfidence that had fueled them now seemed foolish. Every plan they had, every step they had taken had been seen, studied, and documented. They weren't in control. They had never been in control. One of the younger criminals leaned forward, running hands through his hair. "So, what do we do now? We can't just sit here." He stopped, realizing the thought made him sound even weaker. The older man sighed. "There's nothing we can do about what's already happened. But we can be smart from here on. We can't fight blindly anymore. They're too good, too prepared. If we make another mistake, it could end us." The weight of the words sank in. Fear, subtle at first, began to take hold. The criminals had imagined themselves as untouchable, as people who could bend authority with boldness and audacity. But reality was different. They were not powerful. They were exposed. And worse, they had no idea just how closely their every move had been observed. Across the city, the FBI director reviewed the details of the failed confrontation. Calm and methodical, the director's mind was already moving several steps ahead. The criminals had revealed their weaknesses, their tendencies, their patterns. Every overconfident move, every misstep, was now part of a bigger picture. The director's team quietly compiled evidence, prepared backup plans, and ensured that the situation could be resolved without risk to innocent people. Back in the apartment, the criminals tried to make sense of their failure. They replayed the confrontation in their minds, analyzing each detail, wondering why it had gone wrong. Anxiety and fear began to replace anger. The illusion of power they had carried for so long had evaporated in a single encounter with someone who had been ready for them from the start. One of them muttered, almost to himself, "We can't just bluff anymore. They know us. They know everything." The older man nodded. "Exactly. And now, every choice we make will be watched. Every step, every word. It matters more than ever. We can't fix the past. All we can do is try to survive the future." The mood in the room had shifted completely. Where there had once been excitement and bravado, now there was fear and uncertainty. They had believed themselves clever, daring, unstoppable. Now they were forced to confront the reality of their mistake. They had underestimated someone whose patience, experience, and strategy far exceeded their own at the same time. The director's calm approach had prevented any immediate danger. There was no dramatic showdown, no violence, no panic. The criminals had been allowed to reveal themselves, exposing every weakness. In that revelation lay the power. The director understood that confrontation was not always physical. Sometimes, the mere act of patience and observation could dismantle arrogance faster than any force in the apartment. The criminals began to argue, their voices tense and sharp. Each blamed the other, trying to assign responsibility for their failure. But the older man kept his voice steady, cutting through the chaos. "Stop it. Pointing fingers won't change anything. We need to accept what happened, understand it, and think carefully about what comes next. Panic will destroy us faster than them." The realization settled slowly, like a stone sinking in water. They had thought they were untouchable. They had believed they could intimidate someone at the very top. But the truth was unavoidable. They had been wrong. And the consequences of that mistake were only beginning to appear. Outside the city's streets were quiet, but inside the apartment, the criminals were restless. They began to notice small things they had ignored before, the faint possibility of being followed, the idea that their communications might not have been private, the subtle but undeniable sense that they had been outmatched in every way. Across town, the director remained calm. Meetings with the team were brief but precise. Every new piece of information from surveillance and investigation was reviewed carefully. The criminals' mistakes had created a roadmap, and the director knew how to follow it to prevent further danger. Patience remained the key. The director did not overreact, did not show anger, did not display emotion. That was power the kind the criminals had never understood. In the apartment, fear began to dominate. One of the younger men whispered, "We can't stay here. If they come after us..." He didn't finish the sentence. The older man understood without words. They had crossed a line, and now, for the first time, they truly realized how far-reaching the consequences could be. Hours passed. Plans were discussed in hushed tones. No one spoke of confrontation anymore. Survival had become the focus. The arrogance of earlier days had vanished, replaced by a tense, cautious energy. They were beginning to understand that underestimating authority was dangerous, that boldness without preparation could be deadly. The older man glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on each person. "Remember this. This isn't a game anymore. Every move counts. They are prepared for us in ways we can't even imagine. We've already made mistakes. The next one could be the last." Fear settled over the group like a shadow. It was no longer excitement or thrill, it was the realization that they were outmatched, outsmarted, and exposed. Their first mistake had been arrogance. Their second had been overconfidence. And now they could only hope that the consequences would not destroy them entirely. The night deepened. Outside, the city slept, oblivious to the storm that had begun in a small apartment and stretched across offices and surveillance rooms. Inside, the criminals were silent, thinking, plotting, but no longer with confidence. Their minds were filled with questions they could not answer, fears they could not shake, and the dawning understanding that the person they had tried to intimidate was far beyond their reach. And somewhere, quietly, the director prepared for the next steps. Calm, methodical, patient, every action, every plan, every misstep by the criminals was now part of a larger strategy. The game was not over, but the criminals had already lost control. The realization of their mistake was complete, and the consequences were beginning to close in. By the end of the night, the criminals were exhausted, fearful, and uncertain. They had learned something they could never unlearn. Intimidation does not work against someone who is prepared, patient, and observant. They had tried to assert power and had been shown, in quiet but unmistakable ways, just how powerless they really were. The FBI director, calm as ever, understood the lesson of the day in reverse. Power was not in force or fear, it was in preparation, patience, and the ability to watch others reveal themselves. And as the city moved on, unaware, the criminals had finally begun to see the reality they could no longer deny. The city was quiet as morning light filtered through the streets. But inside the criminals' apartment, tension was at its peak. The nights of planning, plotting, and failed confrontation had left them exhausted, nervous, and restless. They moved slowly, spoke in hushed tones, and avoided eye contact. The older man watched them all carefully, knowing that the panic and fear growing among them could not be fixed by words alone. They had made their mistake. They had tried to intimidate someone far more experienced, prepared, and patient than they had imagined. The consequences of that misjudgment were now unfolding. Every small movement, every message, and every decision they had made was being scrutinized. They could feel it, even if they didn't fully understand it. A quiet pressure building around them that they could not escape. One of the younger criminals broke the silence. "We can't stay here. We need to move, disappear. Do something before it's too late." The older man shook his head. "Running won't solve this. It won't erase what we've done. The only thing we can do now is face the consequences and hope to minimize the damage." But even as he spoke, he knew that the consequences were inevitable. The FBI had all the information they needed. Surveillance, communications, patterns all carefully recorded, analyzed, and organized. The criminals had revealed themselves without realizing it. They had handed over everything the authorities needed to respond effectively, and the longer they tried to act, the more mistakes they would make. Across the city, the FBI director remained calm, reviewing reports with the same steady focus that had guided every decision. The failed attempt at intimidation had provided more than just insight. It had revealed patterns, tendencies, and vulnerabilities that would allow the team to act decisively when the time came. There was no rush, no anger, no hasty action, not incremental preparation and precision. Back in the apartment, the criminals tried to plan again, but every suggestion was met with doubt. Fear had replaced confidence. Their bold ideas now sounded reckless, even to themselves. They argued quietly, each blaming circumstances, bad luck, or each other. But deep down, they knew the truth. They had misjudged someone who could not be shaken. And every move from that point on would be under observation by midday. The first agents began to move subtly, quietly, and without warning. Surveillance had been in place for weeks, and now it was time to ensure safety and begin bringing the situation to a controlled conclusion. The criminals, still unaware of the full scope of the FBI's preparation, continued their futile attempts to plan and regroup. The older man tried to warn the others one last time. "Everything we've done has been seen. There's no hiding now. We can only be careful and wait for what's coming." The younger criminals looked at him, panic rising. "But we can't just sit here. If they come after us, we're done. We need a way out." "There is no easy way out," the older man said softly, his voice steady. "The only way is to face what we've done and hope we can survive with what's left." In the following hours, the situation began to resolve. Agents moved in, carefully and deliberately, making sure no one was harmed. The criminals were confronted calmly, their actions documented, and consequences made clear. There was no dramatics, no violence. The operation was precise, controlled, and effective. A reflection of the preparation and patience that had guided the FBI from the beginning. The criminals were taken into custody. Their arrogance replaced by fear, their boldness replaced by resignation. They had learned too late that intimidation against someone who is prepared and patient is a mistake that cannot be undone. Every misstep, every assumption, every act of overconfidence had brought them to this point. Back at the FBI headquarters, the director reviewed the case one final time. The situation had been resolved without risk to civilians, without unnecessary confrontation, and without chaos. The director's calm approach had allowed the criminals to reveal themselves, to expose their weaknesses, and to be dealt with safely. The team gathered briefly, reflecting on the outcome. "It's always about patience," one agent said. "They thought they could scare someone. Instead, they showed us everything we needed to know." The director nodded, eyes calm and focused. Power isn't in fear. It's in preparation, observation, and the ability to remain steady under pressure. They underestimated that, and it cost them. This is a lesson we can all learn from. Meanwhile, the criminals faced the consequences of their actions. Court hearings, investigations, and legal proceedings followed. Their plans, their attempts at intimidation, and their reckless choices were all part of the record. The boldness they had once relied upon now served only to remind them of their mistake. They had thought they were untouchable. They had thought they could manipulate and control. But the reality was far different. In the quiet of the city, life returned to normal. People went to work, children played in the streets, and the hum of daily life continued. Unaware of the events that had unfolded in the shadows, the criminal's story became one of caution, an example of how overconfidence and recklessness can unravel even the most daring plans. The FBI director continued their work, unshaken and resolute. Calm, patient, and strategic, they knew that every situation, no matter how dangerous, could be handled with preparation and intelligence. The lesson had been clear. Those who try to intimidate authority without understanding its strength will always find themselves on the losing side. For the criminals, the realization was bitter and complete. They had attempted to control, to dominate, to instill fear, and in return they had been exposed, restrained, and held accountable. Their boldness had been their downfall. Their mistake had been underestimating someone who was calm, prepared, and observant. And for the director, the case was another reminder of the value of patience, strategy, and integrity. Power did not come from fear or force. It came from understanding, its observation, and the ability to respond calmly in the face of danger. The criminals had tried to intimidate, but they had learned too late that true authority cannot be shaken by threats, arrogance, or boldness. The story ended quietly, without spectacle, but with lessons that would not be forgotten. The criminals had faced the consequences of their mistake, and the director had reinforced the principles that had guided their career: vigilance, preparation, and calm intelligence always prevail over reckless ambition. The city moved on, but the echoes of the confrontation remained, a reminder that overconfidence is dangerous, and patience and preparation are the truest forms of power. The criminals had learned their lesson the hard way, and the FBI director continued their work, steady, calm, and always vigilant, ready for the next challenge that might arise.